South Florida has hired 25 top hunters to capture and kill the snakes. A nearly 17-foot-long python was killed last week.
For 6 weeks, a trail camera sat untouched deep inside Florida's big Cypress National Preserve. It had been placed there by senior python biologist Michael Kirkland, near a suspected Burmese python nesting site. But when the memory card was finally recovered, it contained only 36 seconds of footage. Not of Burmese pythons, not of American alligators, but of something so unusual that, more than 30 years into the invasion, no scientist thought they would ever witness it. Inside the footage was the first ever documented evidence of a native predator turning the tables on a giant Burmese python. But there was something even more shocking. A native snake, nearly erased from these forests decades ago, was now producing wild hatchlings once again. As a senior biologist, Kirk knew that this footage wasn't just another wildlife encounter. It was the first real sign that after 30 years of python invasion, the balance of the Everglades was finally beginning to change. So what exactly was captured in those 36 seconds? And why did it become one of the most important discoveries in Florida's python crisis? Let's dive in. The invasion. At 4:40 on the morning of August 24, 1992, South Florida was struck by Hurricane Andrew. With 165-mile-per-hour winds and storm surges reaching 17 feet, it became one of only 4 Category 5 hurricanes ever to strike the U.S. mainland during the 20th century. Entire neighborhoods were wiped off the map. More than 63,000 homes were destroyed. Another 124,000 were damaged, 65 people lost their lives, and roughly 250,000 people were left homeless. But hidden among all that destruction was something almost nobody noticed. Near Redland, Florida, just outside the Everglades, a python breeding facility took a direct hit. As Hurricane Andrew passed over, the roof was torn away, the walls collapsed, and hundreds of breeding cages were crushed open. Then the flooding began. More than 14 inches of rain covered the surrounding land, turning it into one connected sheet of water. The surviving pythons simply followed the floodwaters into the nearby wetlands and disappeared. At the time, no one cared about a few missing snakes. Florida was a disaster zone, and rescuing people came first. But the invasion didn't begin with Hurricane Andrew alone. There was another reason, one that had been growing quietly for years, and it played an even bigger role. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, Miami had become one of the world's biggest entry points for the exotic pet trade. Because Burmese pythons could be imported legally with very little oversight, they were sold as harmless-looking hatchlings for as little as $15 or $20, cheap enough for almost anyone to buy on impulse. Then they started growing. A baby Burmese python is only about 20 inches long, but under the right conditions, it can grow nearly a foot every month. Within a year, that tiny pet could become an 8 to 10-foot, 50-pound constrictor. Suddenly, it needed larger prey every week, a much bigger enclosure, and constant care. Many people simply weren't prepared for that. So they made what they believed was the kindest choice. They drove into the Everglades after dark, opened the trunk, and let the snake go, thinking they were giving it a better life. But little did they know, they were placing one of the world's most successful predators into almost the perfect habitat. The Everglades sits near the 25th parallel north, almost the same latitude as parts of Myanmar, where Burmese pythons evolved over millions of years. Warm temperatures lasted all year. Water was everywhere, and prey was almost endless. To a Burmese python, this wasn't an unfamiliar swamp. It was home. Even worse, the animals already living there had never seen anything like it. But a 15-foot ambush snake that could strike before its prey even realized the danger that wasn't part of their world. Wildlife biologist Dr. Frank Mazzotti later described it with a comparison researchers never forgot. Releasing Burmese pythons into the Everglades, he said, was like releasing wolves into a petting zoo. At first, few people understood just how accurate that comparison would become. But as the python population grew, something strange began happening. The animals that had always been part of the Everglades were suddenly disappearing. When the swamps went silent. At first, almost nobody noticed what was happening. Burmese pythons are masters of staying hidden. Their blotched skin blends almost perfectly with sawgrass, mud, fallen leaves, and shallow water. In fact, studies have shown that even trained wildlife experts spot less than 1% of the pythons actually living in an area. For every snake they see, dozens more could be lying just a few feet away. That made the invasion almost impossible to measure. And it became even worse because of how these snakes reproduce. Unlike most reptiles that lay their eggs and leave, a female Burmese python stays with her nest for 2 to 3 months. If the temperature drops, she does something few reptiles can do. She rapidly contracts her muscles to produce heat, keeping the eggs warm and greatly increasing their chances of survival. One captured female measured 17 feet long and carried an astonishing 111 eggs. The population wasn't just growing, it was becoming a factory. The real shock came in 2012, when a landmark study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences compared wildlife surveys from before and after the python invasion. Scientists drove the same Everglades roads they had studied years earlier, counting every mammal caught in their headlights. The results were almost impossible to believe. Wildlife biologist Dr. Frank Mazzotti later described returning to places where he had once photographed dozens of mammals in a single evening. Now he could stand there and hear nothing. The Everglades had always been alive after dark. Along roads like Tamiami Trail and Alligator Alley, glowing eyes once filled the night. Now drivers could travel for miles without seeing a single mammal. And this wasn't just a wildlife tragedy. Those missing animals helped spread seeds and shape the vegetation. They also kept one of America's most important wetlands working. Florida couldn't afford to let that system fall apart. So wildlife agencies and scientists launched an unprecedented effort to stop the invasion. But they were about to discover one terrifying reality. Hunting Burmese pythons was unlike hunting almost any other animal on Earth. The impossible hunt. The first big effort was the Florida Python Challenge, organized by the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. Every year, hundreds of hunters from around the world gather in the Everglades, competing for cash prizes by removing as many pythons as possible. In 2024, they caught 195 pythons in just 10 days. That sounds impressive, until you compare it to the estimated population of more than 300,000. It wasn't even close. So Florida raised the stakes. The state created the Python Elimination Program, bringing together professional hunters from the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission and the South Florida Water Management District. Unlike the public challenge, these contractors hunt year-round, day and night. One of the best-known hunters is Donna Khalil, better known as the Python Huntress. She has described the job as hours of driving and wading through waist-deep swamp water without seeing a single snake. Then, in an instant, what looked like an old log suddenly turns into a 15-foot python, as thick as a telephone pole. Removing one giant female can take several people. Some weigh more than 200 pounds, and pulling them through thick mud is as exhausting as it sounds. Since 2017, these professional hunters have removed more than 23,000 pythons. But even that hasn't slowed the invasion. Scientists turned to technology. Thermal drones couldn't spot the snakes because their body temperature almost matches the surrounding water and mud. Scientists capture a male python, implant it with a GPS transmitter, and release it back into the swamp. During breeding season, the male naturally leads them straight to large females and breeding groups hidden deep in the Everglades. It remains the most successful method ever developed. But even that isn't winning. Veteran hunter Mike Kimmel, better known as the Python Cowboy, says the snakes are changing their behavior. They are moving deeper into parts of the Everglades where people rarely go, making an already difficult hunt even harder. And while everyone was focused on catching the pythons, something far more dangerous had already slipped into the Everglades unnoticed. An invisible plague. While studying Florida's native snake populations, Dr. Taryn Farrell of Stetson University noticed something deeply unusual. Native snakes were suddenly showing up with their mouths hanging open, gasping for air. Many were dangerously thin, too weak to defend themselves, and seemed to be slowly suffocating. No one knew why. When Dr. Farrell's team performed necropsies, animal autopsies, they expected to find a disease or bacterial infection. Instead, they found the snake's lungs packed with living parasites. The tiny creatures were blocking the airways from the inside, making it almost impossible for the snakes to breathe. The parasite was identified as Rhyeliatiella orientalis, commonly known as the snake lungworm. It wasn't native to Florida. It had arrived from Southeast Asia, hidden inside the lungs of Burmese pythons. The strange part was that the pythons themselves weren't dying. After millions of years living together, the parasite and the python had reached a kind of biological balance. The pythons carried the lungworms without becoming seriously ill, but Florida's native snakes had no such protection. Dr. Farrell compared it to what happened when European explorers brought diseases like smallpox to the Americas. Those diseases barely affected people who had lived with them for centuries, but they devastated populations that had never encountered them before. The lungworm was doing the same thing, and stopping it was almost impossible. An infected python releases microscopic parasite eggs in its waste. Cockroaches feed on it. Frogs and lizards eat the cockroaches. Native snakes eat the frogs, and the parasite eventually reaches their lungs. This is how the Everglades food chain has always worked. The difference was that now, the Everglades' own food chain had become a delivery system for an invisible killer. Then, Dr. Melissa Miller and her team at the University of Florida made another disturbing discovery. The lungworm had already infected at least 18 species of native snakes and had spread more than 300 miles, reaching as far north as Jacksonville. That alone was alarming. It meant the parasite had traveled far beyond the areas where Burmese pythons first became established. But the next discovery changed the entire picture. The parasite no longer needed Burmese pythons to survive. It was now spreading entirely through Florida's native wildlife. Even if every python disappeared tomorrow, the plague they brought with them would remain. There was, however, one strange exception. While most native snakes were becoming heavily infected, the Florida cottonmouth seemed largely unaffected. Scientists still don't know why. Whatever protects it could one day help save other native snakes. But solving that mystery could take years. And with the invasion still spreading, scientists needed something that could make a difference much sooner. After years of watching one solution after another fall short, they turned to something they had almost lost forever, a native predator that once ruled the southeastern wild. The return of an emperor. That predator was the eastern indigo snake. Long before Burmese pythons arrived, It was one of the southeastern United States' most important native predators, helping keep reptile populations in balance. But decades of habitat loss wiped it out across much of its historic range. By 1978, it had become a federally threatened species. But why did scientists put so much hope in bringing this snake back? The eastern indigo is the longest native snake in North America, growing up to 8 feet long. But what makes it remarkable isn't its size, it's what it hunts. Eastern indigos regularly prey on other snakes. That made them one of the few native predators capable of hunting young Burmese pythons before they reached breeding age. That's why herpetologist Dr. Dirk Stevenson calls it the emperor of the forest floor. Scientists believed restoring this missing predator could help rebuild some of the natural balance the Everglades had lost. But before they could bring the emperor back, they first had to rebuild its home. They used carefully controlled fires to help native plants grow and protected the underground burrows dug by gopher tortoises, where eastern indigos hide from heat, cold, and predators. Only after years of restoring that habitat did conservation teams begin releasing captive-bred eastern indigos back into the wild. No one knew whether the snakes would survive, reproduce, or establish a wild population on their own. Then, in late 2023, a trail camera recorded something that turned decades of conservation work into a real success story. Tiny eastern indigo hatchlings, born in the wild, without any human help. For the first time in more than 50 years, the species was reproducing on its own again. Scientists knew that it wasn't the answer to Florida's python crisis, but after years of setbacks, it was the first real sign that nature might finally be fighting back. However, the eastern indigo wasn't the only reason for that hope. Deep inside Big Cypress National Preserve, another trail camera had already captured a scene that no one expected to see. What the footage revealed: that trail camera belonged to Michael Kirkland, a senior python biologist with the South Florida Water Management District. He had placed it near a suspected python nest and left it there for 6 weeks. When a field technician finally collected the memory card, he called Kirkland immediately. Something on the footage had stunned everyone who saw it. A wild Florida bobcat, weighing barely 25 pounds, had attacked a female Burmese python nearly twice its weight. The camera showed the bobcat returning again and again, eating the python's eggs, then finally killing the giant snake and dragging away its headless body. For years, scientists believed native mammals had no answer to the invasion. This was the first clear evidence that some predators were beginning to see pythons not as an unstoppable threat, but as prey. And it wasn't an isolated case. Alligators had started ambushing smaller pythons in shallow water. Trail cameras had even recorded one of Florida's endangered panthers stalking a python for nearly 20 minutes before moving in for the kill. Researchers also noticed that many predators attacked during cooler weather, when pythons became slower and less able to defend themselves. Then there was the eastern indigo. Scientists don't expect it to defeat giant adult pythons, but young pythons, only 3 or 4 feet long, are a different story. If enough indigos spread through Florida's forests, they could remove thousands of juvenile pythons before they ever reach breeding age. For the first time in decades, nature wasn't just surviving, it was beginning to respond. But one question still remained. Could these signs of hope arrive fast enough to change the future? Or had the invasion already gone too far? A race against time. Right now, Florida is fighting 2 invasions at the same time. One is easy to see, the giant Burmese pythons. The other is almost invisible, the lungworm, a parasite the pythons brought with them from Southeast Asia. And now, scientists are facing one final question. Could that same lungworm also infect the eastern indigo, the very snake that may help slow the invasion? For now, nobody knows. Being immune to venom doesn't mean the eastern indigo is immune to parasites. Those are two completely different biological defenses. That's why researchers are paying close attention to another native snake, the Florida cottonmouth. For reasons they still don't fully understand, cottonmouths seem to resist the lungworm far better than almost every other native snake. Scientists hope that somewhere in its immune system lies the answer that could one day protect the eastern indigo, and perhaps many other native species as well. Meanwhile, the battle continues on every front. Professional hunters are still removing thousands of pythons. Judas snakes are helping researchers locate breeding females. But on the other hand, the pythons aren't stopping. Year by year, they're expanding their range farther north, establishing breeding populations in western Charlotte County, while sightings continue increasing as far north as Brevard County. At the same time, the lungworm is still spreading through Florida's native wildlife, reaching places the snakes themselves haven't fully taken over. So, here we are. More than 30 years after a handful of giant snakes escaped into the Everglades, Florida is still fighting one of the largest invasive species crises in North American history. But for the first time, the story is no longer just about an unstoppable invasion. It's about a race between destruction, adaptation, and nature's ability to fight back. Will the Everglades eventually restore its balance, or has this invasion already changed it forever? Let me know what you think about this in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. And if you don't want to miss what happens next in the Everglades, along with more incredible wildlife stories from around the world, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.